Well, the Oscars are tomorrow, which for me means it's crunch time. I'm one of those people who tries to watch all of the Oscar nominees, but I'm also a procrastinator, so before last week, I hadn't seen hardly any of these. But now that I can confidently say that I've seen most of the films that are mostly represented, I'd like to put them all against each other to see what is the true best film, and also, is it even nominated for the Best Picture? Yeah, I picked a handful of these that I saw were nominated in other categories that looked interesting to me, so you're not gonna see just the top 10 Best Picture nominees in this video. And I'm putting all of these films head-to-head in a tournament bracket to see what is the overall best film of 2024, at least that's been nominated for an Oscar. The combatants in this tournament are as follows: Anora, The Apprentice, The Wild Robot, Flow, Nosferatu, Emilia, Perez, The Brutalist, Conclave, Inside Out 2, Wallace and Gromit, Vengeance Most Foul, Wicked, and The Substance. So without further ado, let's get straight into it with round 1. First on the chopping block, Anora versus The Apprentice. The Apprentice is exactly what it sounds like. It's a biopic that follows a young Donald Trump throughout his life and sort of this transformation he makes into the person he is today. I think the biggest standout in this film is easily Sebastian Stan's acting. In fact, I'm just gonna come right out and say it, he has my support for the best actor in a leading role this year. When playing someone as charismatic as Donald Trump, it's really easy to fall into almost doing an impression. You've seen it a million times on SNL or hell, any late show. They'll move their hands like this a lot, and then they'll purse their lips and they'll be like, it's gonna be yidge. But what impressed me is that there is none of that from Sebastian Stan. You can tell he really analyzed Donald Trump's movements and the way that he speaks, and he doesn't do a voice or anything. It's still his voice, but he kind of gets lost in this role. To be candid, Sebastian Stan is probably one of my favorite actors of all time, and so there's a lot of movies that I go to see particularly for him, and every time he's on screen I get excited. I'm like, that's Sebastian Stan! But what impressed me the most about this movie is throughout the entire time, even though he's the leading actor, I forgot that this was a Sebastian Stan movie. For better or for worse, he puts on a perfect portrayal of Donald Trump. It's something that you really have to see to understand. Also, I said I wouldn't spoil anything, so I can't be too specific here, but trust me when I say that the visual storytelling is incredible, where Donald is metaphorically and literally completing this transformation that he's had throughout the entire film. And the wordless way that they show that is so impressive, and that's just one example of many throughout the movie. But it's not perfect. I mean, none of the movies on this list are. I think that while it works incredibly as a character study, and to be honest, is probably one of the best character studies I've ever seen, in terms of how it works plot-wise or as a movie, it's not great. The plot is essentially just whatever Donald Trump was doing at that time, which I think a lot of biopics can kind of fall into. And that might sound obvious, but you can break down the story of this movie as Trump wants to build something, people won't let him build something. Trump wants to build a second thing, people will let him build it. Trump wants to build a third thing. He can build it because by this point he's famous. And obviously that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but it can cause the film to drag and just feel a little bit more like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's like they had concepts of a story, but overall, I think that The Apprentice does a fantastic job of demonstrating this sort of cyclical and unhealthy ideology that can be really easily adapted into any person who wants to be successful. I do also want to mention the elephant in the room, no pun intended. I know that a lot of people are avoiding this movie because, well, to be frank, they're sick of hearing about Donald Trump. But I do think that this is a movie that can be enjoyed by people on both sides of the political aisle. What really depends on will it upset you or not is if you think that Donald Trump is a good person, because it certainly does not paint him that way. But I know even a lot of right-wing individuals who will be like, well, I don't like him, but he's a good businessman. I'm sure you've heard that a lot. So if you truly do hold those beliefs, I think that there's a lot to be enjoyed here, and I really do appreciate that it didn't comment on things like policy or politics, because I'm also sick of hearing things like that. In fact, it doesn't even include anything about his bid for the presidency. I think it ends in 1980-ish, because Reagan had just gotten elected. So there's still a ways to go before 2016 and before modern Donald Trump history. Moving on to its competitor, Anora. Anora is a film about a sex worker that falls in love with one of her clients who happens to be the son of an oligarch of a foreign nation. I can't remember which one. And pretty early on into the film, I don't think that this is much of a spoiler, they get married. And that is a big point of contention within the oligarch's family because they have their own biases about her being a sex worker. So the main conflict in the movie is trying to get this marriage annulled. And let me just say, Anora has the best acting of any movie. That might just be the end of the sentence. Anora is one of those films that makes you realize just how often you suspend your disbelief for actors. You know, if you can't tell by the poster and the comic books behind me, I'm a really big Marvel fan. The acting in those movies, despite them all being very talented actors, feels sort of unrealistic. And you know, there are moments where they're trying to be relatable and they're trying to sound like real people, and you sort of suspend your disbelief to be like, yeah, a real person would totally talk that way. But the way that Anora is written, acted, and directed, they all feel so real. It feels more like I'm watching an honest-to-God documentary than a fictitious film. The way that they behave, the subtleties in their facial expressions, it all feels so human. And I said it before with Sebastian Stan, but to be honest, I don't think that Sebastian Stan can really hold a candle to Mikey Madison in this role. But it is something that really has to be seen to be fully understood and believed. I don't think that my words can really do justice to the quality of it. Also, fair warning, if you decide to watch Anora after this or after the Oscars, it is gut-wrenching. People didn't tell me that. I thought it was gonna be like a cute little romance, like a love story, you know, an unconventional love story, but no! No! It's the saddest movie I've ever seen! In fact, the only negative that I can really think of for this film is that it does have some moments where it drags. But other than that, it is just fantastic. This is going to be an incredibly difficult movie to beat. And because of that, as much as I really did enjoy The Apprentice, I'm gonna have to give this one to Anora. It's just better in every single way. And now we move on to the second part of round one, The Wild Robot versus Flo. The Wild Robot is another one that is pretty sad, but not nearly to the level of Anora. So The Wild Robot is about, get this, a robot who is designed to help people around the house. Every task that it's given, it must accomplish. However, because of a shipping issue, the robot ends up washing up on this forest. And that's about all I'll say regarding the plot. It has so much to say about parenting and motherhood and things such as. Not to mention that the animation is just gorgeous. I mean, you're looking at the B-roll right now. This is perhaps the best looking film I've seen all year. Which I understand is very subjective, and you know, it has a lot of pretty steep competition even in the live action department, but this art style really appeals to me. I think that it is a beautiful movie. I think that The Wild Robot is severely underrated and is a film that really deserves your attention if you haven't seen it yet. Everyone I know who's seen the movie has had such a passionate love for it after the fact. It is a very impressive work of art. However, its opponent, Flo, is also an incredible piece of art. Flo is about a wild cat whose home gets destroyed as Noah's Ark level flash flooding occurs. You know, the cat, as well as all of the other animals in the film, are wild, so obviously they've got some differences to sort out, which was also a concept present in The Wild Robot. But in order to survive, a lot of these animals that would normally be sort of at odds with one another, or rather be isolationist, have to work together. This movie is so impressive from a visual standpoint. I put this and The Wild Robot together for a reason. They're both incredible on this front. The way that the animators really studied the way that real-life animals move is impressive. I know that sounds like a weird compliment, but the cat moves like a cat, and the dog moves like a dog. I think that in a lot of animated movies that feature animals as their main characters, they have these very unrealistic, almost human-like characteristics. But this is not the case for Flo. They look and move like real-life animals, which makes the visual storytelling in this film all the more impressive. Not a single word is spoken throughout the entire movie, yet everyone in this ensemble cast has a very obvious personality and goals. The way that they all wordlessly work off of each other is an accomplishment, to say the least. Both of these movies are amazing, but in the end, The Wild Robot just spoke to me more. It is a breath of fresh air, because I love DreamWorks as a studio. I really do. I think that The Wild Robot is probably the best animated film I've seen since The Last Wish. But the problem with DreamWorks is how inconsistent they are. You know, I think the last film that they put out before this one was Trolls 3. What? How do you go from Trolls 3 to a masterpiece. You know, I think that both of these movies have a lot to say, but I found that the message in The Wild Robot was a lot more hard-hitting. Additionally, I think that The Wild Robot has a lot more broad appeal. You know, you have to be a very specific kind of snobby movie critic YouTuber to really enjoy Flow, in my opinion. Whereas The Wild Robot is a beautiful piece of art that can be enjoyed by anyone and won't bore certain people. I watched Flow with my family, and they were pretty disengaged compared to me. And I think that it's one of those movies that works for some people and doesn't work for others. But at the end of the day, this is my list, and I like The Wild Robot much better anyway. So I've become a little bit infamous among film bros for my strong distaste for Nosferatu. I'll spare you the details because I have a full 15-minute controversial video about why I did not enjoy the film. But the very basics are, I did not like the story, I think that it was told incompetently, and I think that it was a very bad adaptation of both the original Nosferatu and of Dracula, though some people don't like that I said it was an adaptation of Dracula.
Even though some of the new scenes that were added were from Dracula and not the original film, meaning that it directly adapted certain elements from Dracula, the book and not the movie. It was fair.
But it's fine, I'm not bitter, but I'm just gonna get right into it. I think regardless of my feelings on Nosferatu, I'm not a monster. I'm not gonna say that it's worse than Emilia Perez. Get real. The categories that Nosferatu is nominated for, I think are all well earned. It's all the technical stuff that, in my opinion, it got really, really right. I mean, this is a beautiful movie. It's based on Batman Returns, which is a style of film that I really, really enjoy. Tim Burton was my favorite director for a long time. So having a visual style that's inspired by that, I think is something to be celebrated. Emilia Perez, on the other hand, is terrible. This is like the Unbreakable Boy of LGBTQ+ films. The very basic plot of Emilia Perez is that this drug cartel leader moves to America and transitions. And post-transition, it's sort of treated like she's been absolved of all of the terrible, horrible, no good, very bad things that she did as a leader of the cartel! Not to mention, there is so much Spanish spoken in this film by people who cannot speak Spanish! And look, I'm not a bilingual person, but I've read the experience of people who are Mexican-American immigrants talking about how this is the biggest butchering of the language they've heard in an Oscar-nominated film. I don't want to generalize, but a number of people in the communities that this is trying to appeal to find it to be horribly offensive. And it was made by a French man who, to my knowledge, is cis, white, and straight, who said that he didn't need to do any research on any of these topics because he's pretty well got it. Are you kidding? Also, the movie's a musical. Why is it a musical? If you can hardly speak Spanish, you cannot sing in Spanish. Not to mention, the lyrics and the sound mixing are garbage. And again, I don't want to speak for anyone else here, but I've heard from a number of people in the trans community who post their opinions on Emilia Perez that they feel that it is not indicative of the kind of message that they want to push forward. She transitioned, but she didn't transform into an entirely new person. You know, the idea is that this is who she was all along, and now her external features reflect her internal person. Which means that it's still her who committed all of those crimes, you know? It's not just like a funny, quirky thing when we're talking about the Mexican drug cartel. Yeah, I didn't like the story of Nosferatu, but it has some redeeming qualities. Redeeming qualities that it is nominated for and, honest to God, probably deserves. Emilia Perez simply should not be on any of these lists. Not to mention, outside of all of that, the acting is garbage. Why are we letting this woman be Best Supporting Actress? Are you kidding me? This is a poorly written, poorly directed, garbage film. Nosferatu wins, obviously. In fact, as a side note, because this is unscripted and I forgot to mention it, they had to use AI to enhance the actors' accents so that they actually sound like they're from where they say they're from. And if that's not just the final nail in the coffin, I don't know what is. Not only does it demonstrate insecurity in your own actors, but also, come on, dude. We've had this AI debate for 2 years, and you're nominating films with this kind of stuff in it? That's disgusting. And now we arrive at what I assume will be my first hot take, The Brutalist versus Conclave. The Brutalist is a drama about an architect who escapes a post-war Europe into the United States. Through a stroke of luck, he meets the Van Buren family and is able to gain quite a bit of notoriety for his work. That's where I'm going to stop the description because this movie is a 3.5 hour long roller coaster. First of all, The Brutalist is an excellently shot film. It's an excellently acted film. This movie is so long that it has an intermission, and I would say that everything before the intermission is fantastic. Genuinely, it's well paced, it's interesting, it gets you excited for the second half, and then in the second half, they really lose the plot. It becomes incredibly unfocused, the pacing is kinda terrible, and even in the visual department, it becomes so dark that I could hardly tell what was going on at certain points. I can say with confidence that the last fourth of the movie is just bad. And part of me is like, can I really judge the entire movie on just a fourth of it? But when that fourth is damn near an hour long, I feel like it's fair. This is a movie that is almost 4 hours long and could have been 2.5. In fact, it would have been much better if it was 2.5. It has that same common biopic issue as The Apprentice, where it's like, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and it gets exhausting, especially in the end. And without spoiling, it does not have a satisfying conclusion whatsoever. You made me sit there for 3.5 hours only to have an ambiguous ending that is confusing. This movie has an epilogue, which is a 10-minute long speech that doesn't answer any of the questions that I had. And I don't say this often, but I feel like I wasted my money watching this movie. I did not care for The Brutalist. Had they kept that momentum that they had in the first half, it would have been a completely different story, but unfortunately they didn't, and the part that's the freshest in my mind is the second half that I kind of hated. I will say that if you're someone who likes The Brutalist, I totally understand, and I think that there is plenty good here. You know, I wouldn't say it's a bad movie per se, it's just such a mixed bag. In case you're wondering, on Letterboxd I gave it 3 stars out of 5, so that should tell you something. Conclave, on the other hand, is a completely different story. It's a lot less popular than The Brutalist, but I think it is a much better made film. Conclave is about the ancient Catholic process of deciding who is the next pope. In case you're unaware, the process follows a bunch of individuals called cardinals being sort of locked in this room until they pick one of them to be the next pope. It's sort of a democratic process, so every day they'll vote, they'll burn the votes, and if the smoke is... I should know this, but I don't remember. If the smoke is one color, it means that they haven't picked the pope yet, and if it's another color, that means that they have picked the pope. I've touched on this before in my review of Immaculate, but I am a practicing Catholic, which means that this movie is very personal to me. And again, no spoilers, but this is a film that has and will continue to spark conversation within Catholic circles. Its overall message is that holiness and godliness can come from anyone. And oftentimes we as people will let our prejudice and our pettiness kind of get in the way of that. I have a lot more to say, but I want to save that for a little later in the video. Beyond that, other praise that I can give is that this is the best paced film I've ever seen in my entire life. To be entirely honest with you, I have a hard time focusing on things, but this movie kept me invested for 2 hours. 2 hours that felt like 20 minutes. It is so impressive how it just moves from thing to thing to thing, and then it's over. I remember when they ended up choosing who the Pope was, I checked the time, I was like, how is it almost over? My mind was blown. And the acting in this, while it's not as good as something like Anora or The Apprentice, it's damn good. Also, in terms of the visuals, the set design and the cinematography were mwah. But overall, I can say that it will be a crime if this movie doesn't win for best editing. Yeah, I honestly don't have any notes. I don't have any complaints. This is such a beautiful film. And so, sorry Brutalist fans, Conclave moves on to round 2. Inside Out 2 versus Wallace and Gromit. Now this is an embarrassing one. I watched Inside Out 2 with my girlfriend, and I was very much a Disney adult in that theater. Like, she was made emotional by the film, but for her it was like, you know, she was tearing up a little bit. For me, I was sobbing. By the end of the film, I was a blubbering mess. I love Inside Out 2. And you know, it addresses a lot of the problems that I had with the original too. I mean, even though Riley is very much our main character in that first film, we don't really see much of her. The original feels a lot more like the situation that the emotions get in are directly impacting Riley, rather than Riley's choices directly impacting her emotions. The second film really follows the latter, and it follows Riley as our actual main character instead of Joy. And that was fantastic. I really like the way that they flesh out her character. Obviously, it's a Pixar film, so it's gorgeous, and it's just overall a really good movie. But I do have a note. The emotional hold this movie had on me the first time I saw it cannot be overstated. But I have a nephew, so I've rewatched this movie a lot. And I don't know, by the third rewatch, I was kind of over it. I shouldn't get tired of watching a movie after the third time I watch it. My nephew, he also is in love with Moana, and I will say that that's still one of my favorite animated movies, even though I am a little sick of that one too. But I don't know if I can really say the same for Inside Out. Time has not made the heart grow fonder in this one. Its opponent is Wallace and Gromit, Vengeance Most Foul, and full disclosure, I didn't really grow up with Wallace and Gromit. I know a lot of people were excited for this film, and I definitely see the appeal, but I don't have that sort of nostalgic look that I think a lot of other people did. This movie is about, surprise, surprise, Wallace and Gromit. Now, Wallace, he's a bit of a tinkerer, so he makes this little robot gnome thing that will make gardening a lot easier. But their enemy, this penguin chicken thing guy, Feathers McGraw, I think was his name, he uses Wallace's invention against him. The film has some very obvious themes of why automation is bad, which I think, makes sense coming from a claymation studio during the rise of AI. And so that's a message that I can really get behind and really appreciate. I think that this is a really fun family film, but also, I am not the target demographic for this movie. I'm not one of those people who's like, oh, all animated movies are kids' movies, but this one seemingly has a much younger target demographic, in my opinion. It seems like it's primarily trying to appeal to young British boys, and I'm not one of those, okay? I live in Missouri. And so while I can definitely appreciate this movie from an artistic, thematic, and technical standpoint, it's just not really for me. And that's a really subjective point, but it's my list, It's not like there's anything wrong with it, but I also don't really think that there's anything inherently wrong with Inside Out 2. This is just a battle of preference, and in my opinion, I like Inside Out 2 more. But I will say, it's a close race. I mean, they're both 4 out of 5 movies for me. So if you get mad at me for not liking Wallace and Gromit in the comments, I'm sorry, but just know that it could have moved on pretty easily as well. This choice is less from a critical standpoint and more from a personal one. And for our last debate before we enter into the semi-final round, it's Wicked versus The Substance. These movies have nothing in common. I tried to put a lot of sort of similar movies together, but the leftovers were The Substance and Wicked. Regardless, let's talk The Substance. It was the last film that I watched for all of this. It was the third movie that I watched yesterday, so I was kind of feeling the marathon. But in spite of that, I can say that The Substance gets its critical acclaim for a good reason. The Substance is about this sort of washed-up actress named Elizabeth Sparkle. Now, Elizabeth is feeling very insecure because she's just turned 50 and everyone around her is telling her, you're too old, it's time to get out of the game. She's going through a very relatable struggle of like, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm not as good as these other people, I'm not beautiful enough, I'm not like I used to be, stuff like that. And she feels that way until she's introduced to The Substance. It's basically Ozempic. No, what The Substance does is the host injects it into themselves, and this is where the fun body horror comes in. From their body, a younger clone version of themselves emerges like a cocoon from their spine, and their consciousness is then transferred into the clone. And you have to spend every day of your life with 1 week as the clone and 1 week as the original. Forgive the pun, but this is a movie with so much substance. The subject matter it tackles is varied. I mean, from that description, you might think, oh, it's all about body image stuff, and while that's definitely a part of it, that's not everything. A lot of it is also about substance abuse, particularly how the mistakes that you make in your youth will negatively impact your future. It has themes of responsibility and loving yourself and things such as, which is weird for a horror film. Okay, I have to give a slight spoiler here. It's something that's pretty obvious, but if you don't want to hear about it, just skip until this time. I want to talk about the way this movie is shot. Throughout the film, her younger self takes advantage of her older self, sapping the life from her and turning Elizabeth into a monsterish version of the person she was before. As she becomes more monstrous, Elizabeth is never shot like a monster. There's this scene towards the end where her body is mangled, but she's still spinning like a ballerina. You know, glitter is flying down from the sky on top of her. But the way that everyone else is shot, the way that the people who make her feel like a monster is shot, that is shot grossly. At the very beginning of the film, she's in a meeting with the owner of the production company that she works for, and he's eating shrimp. He's only eating shrimp while he talks to her, which sounds, you know, whatever. But you get these gross up-close shots of him, like, gnawing on it and ripping it apart and taking its head off. And he's just a normal, regular-looking guy, but he's so disgusting. And he's shot like this disgusting monster, while the actual disgusting monster isn't. And I think that's a beautiful way of getting across a point that this movie is trying to make, that society who makes people feel this way, they're the real monsters. And it's something that's not harped on a whole lot in the dialogue of the film, as they're doing a very good job of juggling a bunch of other themes. But having a theme explored almost purely through visuals, that's genius. Here is my second hot take. I don't really care for Wicked. I'm a retired theater kid, so I do think I have some authority to speak on this, okay? Because I know a lot of people are like, oh, you just don't get it, you just don't get the impact of it. Like, no, I've seen Wicked. I was in plays. I was a loser in high school, I get it. What I also get is that this is the antithesis of something like Conclave. This is horribly paced. Obviously, when you're adapting something from Broadway into a live-action film, it's gonna get a little bit longer. You're gonna explore these characters a little bit more so that it works better as a film. That's just how adaptations work. But tell me why this film is, I think, 10 minutes longer than the actual entire show. And even though it wasn't advertised as this, it's only part one. This is half of the play. This is half of the story. And it takes up a longer amount of time than the entirety of the story. Also, plot-wise, it's just a really basic hero's journey. This is nothing that you haven't seen before. It's the classic Disney formula, which I find to be ironic because I was praising Inside Out 2 a minute ago, but this feels like the Disney movie of the year. It's your obvious hero's journey of like, oh, nobody gets me and I'm quirky, but I'm gonna fly high! Defying gravity. And look, I'm not gonna sit here and tell you that Wicked was bad because I liked it, but compared to the rest of the movies on this list, it's not fantastic. If memory serves, it's also up for makeup against Nosferatu and The Substance, which, okay. I mean, it was serviceable, but I feel like the only reason why this was nominated for makeup is because it's really obvious, like, oh, well, green, she's green now. And I want you to compare, well, she's green now, to these incredibly disgusting, lovely prosthetics that were brought forth in The Substance. Mark my words, if Wicked wins for Best Makeup, I'm never watching one of these again. Ultimately, the problem with this is that we're comparing a fine movie, an okay movie, a relatively enjoyable experience with severe pacing issues, but whatever, to a really good movie. And because of that, come on, I gotta give it to The Substance. This is a horror movie YouTube channel. Of course I'm giving it to The Substance. And with that, round one is over. So here's a preview of round two. The films that have advanced and are now going to be facing each other are as follows: Anora, The Wild Robot, Nosferatu, Conclave, Inside Out 2, and The Substance. Starting with Anora versus Nosferatu. Come on. Next up is The Wild Robot versus Inside Out 2. And let me just say, I am so happy that I'm getting to debate DreamWorks versus Pixar, which are two of the most influential studios in my love for filmmaking, in the Oscars bracket. I'm so glad that this is a relatively close race because both of these films were fantastic and they're both from studios that have been dwindling in quality, to say the least. But regardless, in the year of our Lord 2024, they have both produced incredible films, so let's compare and contrast. I talked about the emotional center of both of these movies. I admitted to sobbing in a movie theater filled with children while watching Inside Out 2, and The Wild Robot has a tight grip on my heart. But these are both tackling very different stages in life. Inside Out 2 is all about those awkward teenage years, something that, contrary to what the comments say, I've already lived through, and can feel really heard in my experience. Whereas The Wild Robot tackles something that, personally, I've not experienced yet, and probably won't ever, motherhood. I think that from a thematic stance, both of these are excellent, like cream of the crop at getting across what they want to get across to the viewer. And even though they're both fantastical stories, they feel uniquely human. They both have very different art styles, but in terms of the quality of the animation, I would say that it's pretty even. I personally vibe with the Wild Robots style more, but Inside Out 2 is just something that's been done quite a bit, so that could also be part of the issue for me. And while this is a close race, the second hit to Inside Out 2 is gonna have to be the acting. I found the voice acting and direction in The Wild Robot to be very unique. You know, it's so gradual, but we see our main character, the robot, slowly go from beep boop bop, I am a robot kind of, you know, that kind of speech into something that sounds a lot more honest and emotional. And it's something that I didn't notice until you hear the other robots that appear later in the movie speak to her. Oh, it's like, oh yeah, she used to talk like that, but now she doesn't anymore. And honestly, that's a bit more of a compliment to the direction than to the acting. But when it comes to the acting of Inside Out 2, they hired sound-alikes for Bill Hader and Mindy Kaling, and I think just those two. And they're sound-alikes, you know, it sounds like they are doing an impression of Bill Hader and Mindy Kaling. I wouldn't necessarily say that they do a bad job, but I don't know. Someone doing an impression of someone else feels a lot less natural and honest than the performances that are given in The Wild Robot. And because of that, again, tight race, but I'm gonna have to give it to The Wild Robot. It's just better. Now on to Conclave versus The Substance, and this is going to be hot take number 3 from me, so prepare yourselves. One of the big issues I have with The Substance is that it drags. There's a lot of fat at the beginning of this movie that could very easily be trimmed, and so that already kind of starts it off behind Conclave. But alternatively, Conclave kind of focuses on one central idea, while The Substance effortlessly juggles all of these different themes. The Substance as a piece of art is so impressive in that way. But here's the controversial statement. In terms of the acting, I don't think that anyone in The Substance was a bad actor, and I don't think that anyone in Conclave was a bad actor. I do think that the acting in The Substance was boring, though. I mean, there's so many scenes where Demi Moore is just sort of blankly staring. You know, the emotion in this film comes a lot more through the cinematography than it does the performances. I don't think that in a year where we have performances like the ones in Anora, The Substance is even in the question to win. Whereas Conclave is consistently good. It was good enough to keep me invested, to suspend my disbelief, and to not bore me, which I can't say for The Substance. And while I think that The Substance treats its subject matter with a lot of reverence, it's also a little bit silly, and that's a good thing for me. I like that it's silly, but if you're trying to get me to feel these intense emotions or to really think, I think that the approach that Conclave took was much better. And so this is my hot take. I think that Conclave is much better than The Substance, and we're moving into the final round with no horror movies, which I know is disappointing for some, but I do want to give an obligatory statement as a horror movie reviewer that I'm so glad that horror is being acknowledged at the Academy Awards this year. It so regularly gets swept under the rug, so to have two big heavy hitters like this, even though neither of them made it into my personal finals, that's wonderful. Even though I do have a bit of a vendetta against Nosferatu, I really appreciate its cinematic accomplishment. And so here we are, in the final round. It's Anora versus Conclave versus The Wild Robot. This decision was very, very difficult. I want to say that if you're a fan of any of these movies and you think that any of them should win, that's fair. I've probably thought the exact same thing before. I want to touch on the concepts that we've discussed throughout and tell you which of these three I think does the best job at each. Visuals and cinematography. It's The Wild Robot, easily. I mean, these other movies are beautiful, don't get me wrong, but it had to be The Wild Robot or Anora, and personally, I think that the style of animation that The Wild Robot has is unmatched. A lot of people compare it to Spider-Verse, but honestly, I think that anything with that sort of low frame rate is going to get compared to Spider-Verse. Other than that, it's completely different. And Anora is a very well-shot film, but nothing really stood out to me. And to a much lesser extent, I feel that Conclave is also a well-shot film, but it's not beautiful like Anora, and it's not mind-blowing like The Wild Robot. In terms of acting, you already know, I've gassed it up plenty so far. It's gotta be Anora. But here's the big one. Themes and messages. The Wild Robot, I've talked a lot about its theme. I think it's expertly handled, but to be blunt, it's just not as sensitive or important, in my opinion, as these other two. Anora deals with a lot, but I would say that the primary conflict is the differentiation between sexual attraction and love. I think that final scene, I wish I could talk about it. I wish I could talk about the final scene without spoiling. It just says so much. Anora is a beautiful movie, but I guess I'll just get into it. Conclave spoke to me. I mentioned it earlier, I am a Catholic, and I watched this with my mom, who is also a Catholic. We had a really, really intense discussion after the fact. I mean, we weren't arguing or anything, but we were talking about the meaning of the film for an hour or so. I also touched on its theming before, but I think in the current landscape of Catholicism, this is a really important message to get out there. If I can get on my soapbox for a minute, it is heartbreaking to me to see just how many people use my religion and my faith as a way to justify bigotry and hatred towards others. It's something that happens a lot. Just earlier today, I saw this really cute TikTok video of a priest and a altar servant getting ready for Lent, right? And they did it to the Kendrick Lamar halftime show sound. It's like, bah, bah, bah. And the top comment under it was this nasty attack towards the priest, saying that it is wrong for this altar server to be a girl. It's like, it's specifically for men who are looking to join the priesthood and yada yada. And it's like, no, it's not. It's not about that. It's about becoming more in touch with your faith and serving God. And your sex should not determine if you're allowed to do that or not. And it's not just sex-based discrimination within the Catholic Church. We talk about it a lot, LGBT stuff as well. The way that it demonstrates bigotry in all of its forms is accurate, tragically accurate. And the message of the film is that it doesn't matter who we are on the exterior. It doesn't matter how God made us. We should still love every single individual, which is a concept that is mind-blowingly forgotten in the modern day. And I think that this message didn't really click with a lot of people who aren't actively in the faith, who this isn't a consistent problem for. But I am, and for that reason, the film really worked for me. Yeah, the visuals aren't as good as The Wild Robot, and the acting isn't as good as Anora. But in my opinion, these are all 10 out of 10 damn near perfect movies. And so at the end of the day, my pick has to be the one that is the most impactful to me. The one that sparks conversation, the one that is excellently, incredibly made. Honest to God, going in, I was like, The Substance is a shoo-in. I'm going to love The Substance because every idea that I had heard about it and every review that I read made it seem like that was the movie for me. And then I watched The Wild Robot, and I'm like, this is the best movie of the year. And then I watched Anora, and I was like, there is no way in hell anything can beat this. But when I saw Conclave, I thought it was one of the most powerful pieces of cinema I've ever seen. And yeah, that's subjective, that's based on who I am, but I think I am the audience that this film was trying to reach. And I think that I am living proof that this movie works. And so yeah, overall, tomorrow, I'm going to be supporting Conclave. But if it loses to Anora, that is perfectly acceptable too, and I really understand that because I'm sure that people had a similar reaction to that message that I did to this one. And that's my bracket. I'm sure I've made a lot of enemies like I did with the Nosferatu video and like I did with so many of my other hot take videos, but overall, I'm just so thankful that there are so many pieces of art that can get people to feel all different kinds of ways. So no matter who you're backing tomorrow in the Oscars, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to talk about these films with you. And please remember, believe to achieve.